Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Texts. So in today's episodes, I'll be discussing and talking about Frank McDonough's recent book on Nazi Germany, disasters you can see here, 1940 to 1945. It's the follow-up from his previous book on called Triumph from 1933 to 39, and it's one of the first sort of narrative histories for a while actually on Nazi Germany. This book came out in 2020, and I'm going to sort of explain why I think it's a particularly good book and how you might be able to use it in your own teaching in the history classroom, and give a couple of examples as to how you might do that. First of all, it's refreshing to see in a way, because I think personally, narrative history has had a little bit of a bad rap over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, tend to be seen to be sort of outmoded, maybe a little bit old-fashioned in a sense, and it can come across as perhaps a bit dry for students in a sense, and it's kind of actually kind of engaging with historical debate and issues surrounding any particular event. However, Frank McDonough's book is excellent, is a really good example of high quality narrative history. And what do I mean by that? What I mean in the sense of it's written in a very clear and concise way, very accessible language, not only for adult readers, but I also think for school age readers as well. Very easy to follow, very clear timeline, even though it might move around in terms of the chronology slightly, and also in terms of geographical space at the time. The way that Frank McDonough writes and is very clear and easy to follow, so I think students would actually gain a lot from this. He pins together the different threads of his narrative, often by using sort of little sort of vignettes of evidence to tie them together, which I think is a really nice kind of literary kind of recourse that he has. In the sense that, for example, could use a speech, a letter from a political leader, for example. So as he kind of navigates the political scene obviously here as we move into the Second World War, he uses these little sort of vignettes to piece together the different perspectives at the time and the different sorts of issues and needs of various governments at the time and military and political leaders. So it really is excellent in that sense, and so easy to read as well. Absolutely sort of zip through this in a way. So I just want to kind of have a couple of examples of how you might actually use this in your teaching. So there's a lot in here, and just in this episode I'm going to focus on sort of the beginning of the Second World War, especially in the Western theatre. So in Western Europe, obviously, in 1940. So what you could use, for example, what's quite nice in the book here, if I just open it up, you've got, I should also say as well, it's very well kind of illustrated, some fantastic, original imagery that's used, primary sources that are used to, again, I think, students would kind of warm to that, I think, as well. So just to draw your attention, I think, for example, here we've got, in sort of the late 50s into the early 60s of the pages here, Frank McDonough goes over the rationale for the Nazi invasion of Western Europe, the Battle of France he focuses on. So, and it's sort of the narrative moves between how the British government is reacting to this. So he uses, for example, here a speech by Churchill on the 18th of June in the House of Commons, talking about the dire situation and that the Battle of France is lost, what these potential ramifications mean for Britain, and then he juxtaposes that quite nicely here on the next page with Charles de Gaulle's speech broadcast from Britain for the Free French. So again, to go back to my previous point about using these little kind of pieces of evidence from significant figures at the time to sort of draw together this overarching narrative, which is really refreshing to see. And I think these sorts of sources you could easily use with students in the classroom as well, for them to actually start to examine how the political leaders of the time were reacting to events as they unfolded. Moving on from that as well, as we go through the kind of the fall of Western Europe, and then we actually go to the armistice and the surrender that's signed in Compiègne. I think this is a really nice point as well, that you can use obviously McDonough's text here, how he presents this narrative. That will be useful for students to kind of engage with the ongoing debate around the causes and the course of the Second World War. What I mean by that, in this sense, you've got the kind of the culmination, I suppose, in one sense, of Hitler kind of almost fighting the First World War still. So the idea, of the signing of the French surrender here in the exact same place that the First World War capitulation was signed, the armistice was signed by Germany in 1918. So I think, especially as a teacher, if you've already taught the First World War, this would be a really nice way to link into how the impact of the First World War is still being felt a generation later. Because there's a tendency for students just to see historical periods ending in a way, even though you have the key concept of consequence, for example. But I often find that students struggle to fully comprehend how seismic events like the First World War will affect, for many years, will affect the political and economic landscape and cultural landscape of countries, in a sense. So you could use this part here, and again, another famous photograph that McDonough uses of Hitler touring Paris in June 1940. So, and at this part actually, which is on page 70, it's a really nice link. You could look at the consequences at the time, not only of, in a way, I suppose, perhaps in Hitler's mind, of kind of ending that element of the First World War, that kind of shadow, if you like, of the First World War, and perhaps from his perspective, which is intimated here, the sort of shame of that in a way, and kind of the vindication for the end of the First World War from a German perspective, from Hitler's view. So that would be a nice perspective to discuss and use with students to show the legacy and the shadow of the First World War over, way up into the 1940s. But also at this point as well, McDonough talks about how these sudden victories, and to a certain extent unexpected victories that he talks about before, then create their own momentum in a sense. So he cites, for example, General Jodl, for example, talking about Hitler now becoming convinced of his own infallibility in terms of his military judgment. So this would be, again, another useful segment here that you could use in the classroom for students starting to see, how is the war changing at the time. And I think that would be useful in another way for getting students to actually see the interplay between how the developments of the war militarily, whether that be victories or defeats, then impacts political decision making. So I think that would be really useful, especially early on in your study or course of study about the Second World War. So it's really good. And the last thing from this little section here that he goes on to talk about is this sort of myth of the effectiveness of German blitzkrieg tactics. So again, this is another aspect that you could use to draw students into the ongoing debate about the preparedness or lack of preparedness of Britain and France for a potential German attack. And here McDonough firmly lands on the sense of that Britain and France lacked preparedness. And this goes against other historians, for example, spring to mind, for example, Sam Willis, who argues more in the case of there was more preparation going on. And it's an ongoing debate, and it's one that I think would be very engaging for students to, and again, this is a useful segment that you could use to draw them into that ongoing debate. So it's really good. McDonough here is talking about the fact that he's saying that actually Britain and France were quite, woefully unprepared for an attack, and that actually those, that there's only a certain amount, he quotes here, I believe, only about 10 German divisions that were fully mechanized. So again, you could use that in your teaching to see, as evidence, historians presenting evidence to support their case or their point in a sense. So again, useful, I think, for students, students of history to engage with secondary sources especially. So this is there's lots in here, and no doubt I'll go into other aspects of the book in later episodes, but it really is I cannot recommend this highly enough. It's a really engaging read, full of useful primary sources as well that you can use and draw into your teaching as well. So that's all from me today. I hope you found that useful, and more from me soon. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Bye bye.